Princess Valerie sat stiffly in the grand hall of the Xilari royal palace, her hands clenched together as she listened to her father's words. The emperor's deep voice echoed through the chamber, filled with power and finality. "You will marry General Alexander Graves of the Terran Federation." Valerie's heart pounded in her chest. She could hardly believe what she had just heard. Marry a human, a Terran warlord. The very thought sent a shiver down her spine. "But father, they are our enemies," she protested, her silver-blue eyes wide with disbelief. "The humans destroyed our fleets, crushed our armies. And this man, this General Graves, he is known as a ruthless conqueror." Her father, Emperor Xeltorin, gazed at her with the heavy eyes of a ruler who carried the weight of an empire. His long, regal robes shimmered in the soft glow of the chamber's energy crystals. "The war is over, Valerie. The Xilari Empire cannot afford another conflict with humanity. We must ensure peace, and this marriage will secure it." Valerie's hands trembled, but she forced herself to stay composed. She had heard stories of the humans, creatures of war, beings of aggression. When the war between the Xilari and the Terrans had begun, their people had underestimated humanity. The Xilari, proud and technologically advanced, had thought the war would be quick and decisive, but the humans had fought like nothing the galaxy had ever seen. They did not surrender, did not break. Even when outnumbered, they fought harder. Even when wounded, they stood again. And when the war finally ended, it was the Xilari who knelt before them. And now she was to be given to their greatest warrior, their most feared commander. Her mother, Empress Lavessa, placed a gentle hand on Valerie's shoulder. "I know this is difficult, my daughter," she said softly, "but you must be strong. This is bigger than you." Valerie closed her eyes, her chest tightening. She understood. She had been raised as a princess, trained to serve her people. She knew that royal marriages were never about love or personal desires. But still, she could not stop the fear creeping into her heart. Would this human treat her with cruelty? Would he see her as nothing more than a trophy, a reminder of his victory? She had heard his name before, Alexander Graves, the butcher of Corthan Ridge, the Iron Wolf of Terra. The way Xilari generals spoke of him, it was as if he were a beast, an unstoppable force. They said he showed no mercy in battle, that he crushed enemies with cold precision. And she was supposed to stand beside him as his wife. She wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but board the ship that would take her to Terra Prime. But duty held her in place. "I understand, father," she finally said, her voice quiet but steady. "I will do what is required of me." The emperor nodded approvingly, but Valerie saw the brief flicker of sadness in his gaze. He was sending his only daughter into the unknown, to the people who had nearly destroyed their empire. He knew this was not easy for her. The preparations were swift. Within days, a grand Xilari diplomatic vessel was prepared for her journey. As she stepped aboard, dressed in royal silver and blue, her heart felt heavy. The stars stretched before her as the ship left the homeworld behind. Each passing moment brought her closer to Terra, to him. She stared out of the window, watching as the vastness of space swallowed her familiar sky. Would she ever feel at home again? Would she survive what awaited her on Terra? She did not know, but she was about to find out. The Xilari diplomatic vessel glided through the dark void of space, approaching the massive human capital world, Terra Prime. Princess Valerie stood near the viewing window, her silver-blue eyes locked onto the planet below. It was different from her homeworld, where Xilari cities were sleek, glowing towers built into floating islands. Terra was vast, covered in sprawling cities, towering skyscrapers, and endless oceans. It looked powerful, strong, unshakable. Her hands clenched at her sides. This was the home of General Alexander Graves, the man she was to marry. She had spent the entire journey preparing for this moment, repeating what she knew about him. A ruthless commander. A man feared across the galaxy. A human warlord. As the ship entered the planet's atmosphere, Valyrie's heart pounded. The landing bay was massive, filled with human soldiers standing in perfect formation. Their uniforms were crisp, their expressions unreadable. She expected hostility, maybe even resentment. After all, she was a Xilari princess, a reminder of their former enemy. But the humans did not glare at her with hatred. They did not sneer or whisper. Instead, they stood with silent discipline, watching her arrival with unreadable expressions. The ramp lowered. It was time. Taking a deep breath, Valyrie stepped forward, her royal robes flowing behind her. She kept her chin high, her posture strong. She would not show fear. Then she saw him. General Alexander Graves stood at the end of the ramp, waiting for her. The first thing she noticed was his height. He was tall, even for a human, with broad shoulders and a strong build. He wore a dark military uniform, decorated with medals of honor. His face was sharp, his jawline strong, and his piercing gray eyes locked onto hers. For a moment, time seemed to slow. This was the man she had feared, the ruthless warlord she had imagined as a monster. He did not look cruel. He did not look angry. He looked unreadable. Valyrie forced herself to keep walking, her heart pounding with every step. When she finally reached him, he bowed his head slightly in a formal greeting. "Princess Valyrie," he said, his voice deep and controlled. His tone was not unkind, nor was it overly warm. It was measured, respectful. She hesitated for only a moment before responding, her voice steady. "General Graves." They stood there, facing each other, the silence stretching between them. She had expected something else. Perhaps a smirk, a cold remark, or even a dismissive glance. Instead, he simply observed her, his expression calm and unreadable. Then, after a brief pause, he extended his arm toward her. "Shall we?" Valyrie's breath caught. She glanced at his arm, unsure. This was a human tradition, was it not? A gesture of respect. After a moment's hesitation, she placed her hand lightly on his forearm. His grip was firm but not forceful. Together, they walked toward the waiting transport vehicle, the human soldiers watching in silence. Inside the vehicle, the atmosphere was quieter. She sat across from him, her hands resting on her lap. He studied her for a moment before speaking. "I imagine this arrangement is not what you wanted." She blinked, surprised by his directness. "No, it is not." His lips quirked slightly. Not quite a smile, but not unfriendly either. "Honest. I appreciate that." She frowned slightly. "And you? Do you want this?" He leaned back slightly, his gray eyes thoughtful. "I want peace, and this marriage is a way to secure it." It was not the answer she had expected. She had thought he would speak of duty, of political strategy. But instead, he spoke of peace. For the first time, doubt crept into her mind. Was it possible that she had misjudged him? The transport moved smoothly through the towering human city, and as they traveled, Valyrie glanced out the window. She saw humans walking through the streets, civilians, families, children laughing as they played. These were not warriors, not monsters. They were people. The realization unsettled her more than she expected. She turned back to the man before her, the human warlord who was not acting like the ruthless conqueror she had feared. Perhaps this marriage was not going to be what she had imagined. Perhaps General Alexander Graves was not the man she had expected him to be. Princess Valyrie stood in the grand hall of the Terran capital, her gaze moving across the massive chamber. The room was filled with human officials, high-ranking military officers, and Xilari diplomats. The walls were lined with banners bearing the Terran Federation's insignia, a silver eagle soaring above a blue planet. The atmosphere was formal, heavy with expectation. This was the official welcoming ceremony for her, a moment to present her to the people of Terra Prime. But to Valyrie, it felt like a battlefield. She stole a glance at General Alexander Graves, who stood beside her. As always, his expression was calm, unreadable. He wore a sharp military uniform, every detail perfect. The way he held himself, straight-backed, powerful, commanding, made it clear why humans followed him. She had expected him to act proud, arrogant, or even dismissive toward her. Instead, he had been controlled. He had not spoken much since they had arrived, but when he did, his words were measured, precise. She still did not trust him. As the ceremony began, a high-ranking Terran official stepped forward and spoke in a deep, authoritative voice. Today marks the beginning of a new era. The war between the Xelari Empire and the Terran Federation has ended, and to ensure lasting peace, our great leader, General Alexander Graves, and Princess Valerie of the Xelari will unite in marriage. The crowd did not cheer. Instead, they observed silently. Valerie could feel their eyes on her, studying, judging. She knew what they must be thinking. Why should we welcome a Xelari princess? She is one of them, the ones who fought against us. Does she even belong here? A familiar feeling rose inside her, pride, defiance. If these humans expected her to bow her head, they would be disappointed. The official turned toward her. Princess, do you have anything to say to the people of Terra? Valerie hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward. She met the gaze of the crowd and spoke with the same strength she had used in the Xelari court. I know that many of you may not welcome me, she said. I understand. Our two peoples have fought. We have seen loss. We have suffered. The silence in the room deepened. Even Graves was watching her now, his gray eyes unreadable. But the war is over, she continued, and I did not come here as an enemy. I came here to honor the peace that was won. I came here to stand beside General Graves, not as a prisoner, but as an ally. She paused. The humans continued to watch her, their expressions difficult to read, but she stood firm, refusing to look away. Finally, the official nodded. Well spoken, princess. The ceremony continued, but Valerie could feel the tension in the room. Even as people clapped politely, she knew she had not won their trust yet. Later that evening, she found herself seated beside Graves at a formal dinner. The long table was filled with diplomats, officers, and important figures from both sides. Plates of human food were placed before her, but she had little appetite. She turned to Graves. Your people do not trust me. He sipped from his glass before answering. They do not trust easily. She frowned. Is that why you fight the way you do? Without mercy. His gray eyes met hers. You think I do not show mercy? I have read the reports, she said. The battles you led. The way you crushed our forces. You did not hesitate. Graves set his glass down, his expression unreadable. War is not a place for hesitation, princess. She studied him, searching for something behind his mask of control. Do you regret it? A pause. Then he spoke, his voice quieter than before. I regret that it was necessary. Valerie blinked, surprised by his honesty. She had expected denial, justification, something cold and calculated. But instead, he spoke as a man who had seen too much of war. Before she could respond, a voice interrupted them. General Graves. A Terran officer approached, saluting. We have an urgent matter. Graves turned to Valerie. Excuse me. As he stood and walked away, Valerie watched him go, her mind filled with questions. The ruthless warlord she had feared was not as simple as she had thought. And for the first time, she was not sure if that frightened her or intrigued her. Princess Valerie wandered through the halls of Terra Prime's central government building, her thoughts heavy. It had been 2 days since the formal ceremony, 2 days since she had arrived in the heart of the Terran Federation. Yet, despite the official welcome, she still felt like an outsider. The humans were not openly hostile, but they were distant. Their stares lingered too long, their conversations hushed when she passed. She was the alien here, the former enemy. And then there was General Alexander Graves. She had spent the last 2 days watching him, studying his movements, His words. He was not cruel. He did not gloat about his victories or treat her like a prize. He was controlled, precise, but there was something deeper beneath the surface, something she could not yet understand. She needed to know more. So when she heard he was leaving the compound for an inspection, she decided to follow. A different battlefield. The transport vehicle moved smoothly through the capital city. Valkyrie sat beside Graves in silence as they passed towering skyscrapers and wide streets filled with humans. She had expected a planet ruled by a warlike species to feel harsher, colder, but instead she saw life. Shops filled with merchants, families walking together, children running through parks, laughing. This was not the world of conquerors she had imagined. The vehicle came to a stop outside a large facility. Graves stepped out first, nodding for her to follow. "This is the Veteran Recovery Center," he said as they walked through the entrance. Inside, the atmosphere was quiet but warm. Humans in medical uniforms moved between patients, soldiers recovering from injuries sustained in battle. Some had missing limbs, others bore scars. Valkyrie watched as doctors and nurses tended to them with care. She had never considered what happened to human soldiers after war. In Xilari culture, the wounded were often hidden away, their weaknesses not meant for public display. But here, they were treated with respect, not shame. Graves approached a soldier in a wheelchair, a young man with sharp brown eyes. His right arm was gone, replaced with a mechanical limb. The soldier straightened when he saw the general. "Sir," he greeted. Graves nodded. "How's the new arm, Corporal?" "Still getting used to it," the soldier admitted, flexing the fingers of his prosthetic. "But the docs say I'll be back to full function soon." Graves placed a hand on the man's shoulder. "Good. And if you need anything, you contact my office." The soldier smiled. "Of course, sir. Thank you." Valkyrie watched, confused. This was not the behavior of a ruthless warlord. She turned to Graves. "You know them." He gave her a sideways glance. "They fought under my command. I do not forget my people." Valkyrie hesitated before asking, "And what of the auxiliary soldiers who were injured?" Graves didn't react immediately, but when he spoke, his voice was firm. "The war took from both sides, Princess. I respect those who fought, no matter where they came from." His words unsettled her. She had expected him to be proud of his victories, to see the Xilari as nothing more than defeated enemies. Instead, he acknowledged their loss, and it made her wonder, had she misjudged him completely? A new perspective. As they left the facility, Valkyrie remained deep in thought. She had been raised to see humans as dangerous, as creatures of war. And yet, here they were, caring for their wounded, building their society not on destruction, but survival. She turned to Graves as they walked toward the transport. "You fight so fiercely, but you also protect your own. I do not understand." Graves stopped and faced her. "Because war is not about destruction, Princess. It's about defending what you love." His words sent a strange feeling through her chest. She had spent so much time fearing this man, but now she was starting to see him in a different light. For the first time, she wondered, had she been wrong about Alexander Graves? Princess Valkyrie sat on the balcony of her new residence in Terra Prime, staring at the endless lights of the human capital. The city stretched far into the horizon, filled with towering skyscrapers and flying vehicles. It was beautiful in its own way, different from the floating crystal cities of her homeworld, but alive with energy. And yet, despite its beauty, she still felt like a stranger. 2 weeks had passed since her arrival. Every day, she was introduced to new officials, taken to new places, and expected to smile and nod at human diplomats. She played her role well, but the humans remained distant. The war was over, but trust did not come easily. And then there was General Alexander Graves. He was the greatest mystery of all. She had expected cruelty, arrogance, or even indifference. Instead, he was calm, controlled, and surprisingly thoughtful. He had shown her the reality of war's cost, the wounded soldiers, the families left behind. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried weight. She found herself watching him more, searching for something beneath his cold exterior. And she wasn't sure if she liked what she was finding. An unexpected invitation. That evening, as she sat lost in thought, a knock came at her door. A human attendant entered and bowed slightly. "Princess Valerie, General Graves requests your presence in the courtyard." She frowned. "For what purpose?" The attendant hesitated. "He did not say, Your Highness, only that it was important." Curious, she rose from her seat and followed. The courtyard was quiet, illuminated by soft golden lights. A light breeze moved through the open space, carrying the scent of flowering trees. And there, standing near a stone pathway, was Graves. He was out of uniform for the first time she had seen, dressed in a simple dark shirt and trousers. Without his military armor, he looked less like the unshakable warlord she had feared, and more like a man. "General," she greeted carefully. "Why have you called for me?" Graves gestured to a wooden training circle in the center of the courtyard. "I wanted to see how well a Xilari princess can fight." Valerie blinked. "Excuse me. I assume you were trained," he said. "The Xilari royal family does not raise weak rulers." She crossed her arms. "I was trained in self-defense, yes." Graves nodded. "Good. Then spar with me." She narrowed her eyes. "Is this some kind of test?" "Consider it an exchange," he said. "I have shown you how humans fight for peace. Now show me how a Xilari fights for honor." His words intrigued her. A part of her wanted to refuse, to remind him that she was not here for entertainment. But another part, one she had ignored for weeks, was curious. She had spent so much time seeing him as a warlord, but what if he was more than that? Slowly, she stepped forward. "Very well, General." The dance of warriors. A few human soldiers gathered at the edge of the courtyard, watching in silence as Valerie and Graves faced each other. He moved first. A quick, testing strike. Fast, but not full force. Valerie dodged easily, her movements fluid. She countered with a sharp, calculated strike, aiming for his side. Graves blocked, his strength undeniable. Their movements became faster, strikes and dodges flowing in perfect rhythm. Valerie felt something stir inside her. She had been trained in combat since childhood, but this was different. There was no hatred in his attacks, no cruelty. It was a challenge, a test of skill. For the first time, she saw the warrior behind the title. Graves was strong, but not reckless. He was precise, calculating every move, every step. He fought like a man who had survived countless battles, not just with force, but with intelligence. And she was enjoying it. She spun, aiming for his shoulder, but he caught her wrist and twisted slightly, forcing her off balance. Before she could recover, he stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You hesitate." Her breath caught. He was close, too close. She could see the sharp intensity in his gray eyes, feel the warmth of his presence. For a moment, they were locked in place, neither willing to yield. Then, slowly, Graves released her wrist and stepped back. "You fight well, Princess." Valerie exhaled, her heart still racing. "You are not what I expected." Graves gave the slightest hint of a smirk. "Neither are you." As she stood there, staring at the man she had once feared, Valerie realized something strange. The walls between them were beginning to crack. Princess Valerie sat by the large window of her quarters, gazing out at the endless lights of Terra Prime. The city was alive even at night, but her mind was far away. It had been 3 weeks since she arrived, 3 weeks since she had been forced into this alliance. Yet everything she had believed about humans, about General Alexander Graves, was changing. She had spent time among his people, seen the way they lived, the way they protected each other. And then there was Graves himself, She had once feared him, hated him even. But now he was a puzzle she couldn't solve. He was a warrior, yes, but he was also something more. And the way he had looked at her during their sparring match, she had not been able to forget it. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Enter," she called. The door opened, and to her surprise, Graves himself stepped inside. He was once again out of uniform, wearing a simple dark jacket and pants. His presence filled the room with quiet intensity. "Princess," he greeted. "General," she responded, standing. "To what do I owe the honor?" He studied her for a moment before speaking. "Come with me. There is something I wish to show you." She hesitated, but curiosity won over. "Very well." A night among humans. They walked through the city streets, away from the towering government buildings, and into a district filled with lights and movement. "This is the Old Quarter," Graves explained, "one of the oldest parts of Terra Prime. No official events, no diplomats, just people living their lives." Valdiri observed everything carefully. The streets were lined with small shops, open-air food stalls, and music drifting through the air. Humans of all kinds walked together, laughing, talking, moving as if the war had never happened. "Why bring me here?" she asked. Graves walked beside her, his expression unreadable. "You have spent weeks surrounded by soldiers, politicians, and people who still see you as an outsider." He glanced at her. "I thought you should see what normal humans are like." Valdiri was quiet for a moment. "And do you think they will welcome me?" Graves smirked slightly. Humans are unpredictable. As they walked, a small child ran past them, laughing as she chased a mechanical toy. The child stopped suddenly when she saw Valdiri, her eyes widening in wonder. Valdiri expected fear, hesitation, but instead the child smiled. "Your hair is pretty," the girl said. Valdiri blinked in surprise. Her silver blue hair, a common trait of Silari nobility, had always been a mark of her status. But here, this small human saw it as something beautiful. She found herself smiling. "Thank you." The child giggled before running back to her family. Valdiri turned to Graves. "I expected more fear." "Not everyone sees you as an enemy," Graves said. "Some just see another person." Something inside her shifted at his words. She had spent so long thinking of their differences, of the walls between them. But perhaps they were not so different after all. The general without his armor. They stopped at a quiet rooftop overlooking the city. The view was breathtaking, the lights of Terra Prime stretching far into the distance. Valdiri glanced at Graves. "You are different here." He raised an eyebrow. "How so?" "You are always in control, always calculated. But here, you seem more at ease." Graves was silent for a moment before he spoke. "I was born in a place like this. Before the war, before the battles. I was just another boy running through the streets." Valdiri had never imagined him as anything but a soldier. "And now you are the most feared warrior of your people." He exhaled slowly. "War changes people." She studied him carefully. "And what did it change in you?" Graves met her gaze. "It taught me how to survive, how to lead, how to make the hard choices." Valdiri hesitated before asking, "Do you regret it?" For the first time, his mask cracked. His expression softened just enough for her to see past the hardened exterior. "There are things I wish had never happened," he admitted. "But I do not regret protecting my people." Something inside her chest tightened. She had always seen him as a conqueror, a warlord. But standing here, under the stars, she saw something else. A man who carried the weight of too many battles. A man who was far lonelier than he let anyone see. Valdiri took a slow breath. "Perhaps we are not so different, General." Graves turned to her, and for the first time, there was something in his eyes she had never seen before. Understanding. And maybe, just maybe, something more. Princess Valdiri stood at the balcony of her quarters, looking out at the city of Terra Prime. The lights shimmered like distant stars, the hum of the city alive beneath her. She had spent weeks here, surrounded by humans, learning their ways. And yet, tonight felt different. Something had changed between her and General Alexander Graves. She had spent so much time fearing him, believing him to be a ruthless warrior. But now she knew better. He was strong, yes, a leader, a man who had fought and won countless battles. But beneath the armor of duty, she had seen something else. Someone who carried the weight of responsibility, someone who had sacrificed much for his people. She had seen the man behind the legend. And now, she could not stop thinking about him. An unexpected visit. A knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. "Enter," she called. The door opened, and Graves stepped inside. As always, his presence filled the room with quiet intensity. But tonight, there was something different about him. His expression was unreadable, his eyes focused on her as if searching for something. "You are awake," he said. She tilted her head. "I could say the same about you, General." He exhaled, stepping closer. "Tomorrow, you will meet with the High Council. They will decide the next steps of this alliance." She nodded. "I know." He hesitated for a brief moment before speaking again. "Are you ready?" Valerie looked at him carefully. "I do not know." She had come here expecting imprisonment, expecting to be treated as a trophy of war. Instead, she had been given freedom. Freedom to see, to understand, and to question everything she had once believed. The Xilari had taught her that humans were nothing more than conquerors, but she had seen families, kindness, and a people who fought not for glory, but to protect their own. And then there was him. Alexander Graves, the man who had been her greatest fear, now stood before her not as an enemy, but as something far more complicated. "I was taught to believe humans were dangerous," she said softly. "That you only knew how to destroy." Graves held her gaze. "And now?" She hesitated. "Now, I do not know what to believe." Silence stretched between them. Then, Graves took a slow step forward. "You asked me once if I regret the war," he said. "There is something I do regret." Valerie's breath caught. "What is that?" His voice was quieter now. "That it took a war for us to meet like this." Her chest tightened. Those words, so simple, yet so heavy. For weeks, they had danced around something unspoken. Duty had kept them apart. Fear had built walls between them. But now, in the quiet of the night, there was no war, no politics, only the two of them. And Valerie realized the truth. She did not fear him anymore. She admired him, respected him, and perhaps, deep down, she felt something even more dangerous, something she could not allow herself to name. The path forward. She turned to face him fully. "What happens now?" Graves was silent for a moment before he spoke. "That depends on us." She searched his face, looking for any trace of deception. But there was none. She had spent her life preparing for war, for duty. Never had she considered the possibility of something more. And yet here she was, standing before the man she once feared, wondering if fate had led them here for a reason. Slowly, Valerie nodded. "Then let us decide together." For the first time in her life, the future was uncertain. But for the first time, she was not afraid.